What's going on, YouTube? Welcome to another D&D Fridays. Welcome to the Geek Life, where all we do is keep your life geeky. Let's kick into today's episode, where we're going to be taking a look at probably one of the more basic elements of the game, the three pillars of D&D. Which, for those who might not know or remember, those three pillars include combat, roleplay, and exploration. So, without further ado, let's get into it.
Do it.
So let's start off with probably my favorite pillar of D&D, which is combat.
Yeah, combat's pretty fun. I enjoy it once in a while too.
Yep, as long as you're not being power word kill when you're under 100 HP.
Yeah. We don't want to go to the extreme here for sure.
But basically, what combat is all about is your character along with all of your misfits, if you would call it, of a venturing party. Basically, taking on some enemies, be it town guards, beholders, Trask, and everything in between.
Oh, we're going big or going home tonight, are we? Pulling out the Trask already.
Yep. Although, if you're under about level like 18, you should probably run from a Trask.
If you're under level 25, you should run.
Unless you have a very good spell combo or something like that. So basically, during combat, you do what's called a turn order, which where based on whatever you roll your initiative, which is just a d20 plus your dex mod, um, you're pretty much just taking turns in kind of like your traditional RPG per se. Um, Slinging spells, taking attacks, hiding places, disarming traps, whatever it may be that you wish to do. And there's actually a few different things that you can do during your turn, such as you can take an attack action, a cast a spell action, dash, disengage, use an object, or use the help action. There you do get one free interact with the is it interact with an object or interact with the environment, so that you can use every turn, such as unsheathing one weapon or sheathing a weapon or something to that nature. If you want to do anything extra, you will need to either take an action to do so, or if you have some sort of feat that allows you to do that, whether it's like the rogue's cunning action or something like that.
So, so the actions for combat are attack, cast a spell, dash, disengage, dodge, help, hide, or ready.
Yeah. And when it comes and
Oh,
when it comes to ready in action, there's actually a little bit of a that's actually probably one of the more tricky actions to take, if not the trickiest action to take on your turn. If I'm not mistaken, when you ready your action, you have to specify what the trigger is for your action, and then you can either take an action, such as a dash or whatever, or use your movement. So, for instance, you can say if the if the golem comes within 10 feet of me, I want to use my movement to move away, for example. However, there's one little thing. Um, if you decide to take the attack action to make a melee or bow and arrow attack, you can only take one of those attacks with your ready action, if I'm not mistaken. Unless your GM hand waves it for for homebrew perspectives. So that's
right.
definitely a little bit of a keep in mind type of thing for everyone. from both a GM and a player's perspective.
There,
Also,
there
I'm
there's
sorry.
two other actions I forgot. Search and use an object, which you already kind of went over. So,
Yeah.
and yes, I am cheating.
Well, I guess it's not so much cheating as I'm pretty sure there's no one that knows every single rule.
It's very hard. It's difficult to remember that there are what? That's nine. 10 different things that you can do when 90% of the time you're attacking, casting a spell, dashing, disengaging, or dodging, right?
Yeah.
You don't really think of helping and hiding and ready in action or searching or using an object as an action,
Yeah.
right? Especially to use an object, I've probably asked 100 different times if can I use this object? Can I do something else? Can I use an object as my bonus action or as a bonus action? Um,
Yeah.
not thinking that it's an actual action.
Yeah. I think when most people think of using an object action, it's most of the time it's, hey, I want to use like the a magic item, like I want to use the staff of healing or something like that. But
Right.
other than that, it's like, can I really do that or not? Yes, yes, you can. And it's like, or it's like during combat, you want to make a ability check for something. Like, I want to, I want to use my perception ability check to see if I could figure anything out besides that. That's an action. Or it's
Yep.
like, I want to try to hide. Unless you're a rogue with cunning action feature, that's an action to try to stealth.
Exactly. Exactly. It's that translation of saying that it's an action versus just something else that you're doing, right? I personally don't always equate it to it taking up the action slot, right?
Yeah. And and also when it comes to combat, I think one of the other big things that I've seen a lot of folks got get wrong is the surprise round.
I was just about to ask you, what are your thoughts on surprise rounds?
Yep. So rules as written, whenever you take the surprise round, you're actually supposed to call for initiative beforehand, and then go like usual. And whichever creatures are surprised, you skip their turn for that first round.
Ah, interesting.
Yep.
Okay.
And until you get through your first, and if let's say your character is surprised, until you get to your first, until you pass your first surprise turn, you can't take any sort of actions, reactions, anything like that, unless you happen to have some sort of feature that negates it. Like the barbarians have something that allows them to say, "Nah, I'm not surprised as long as the first thing I do is enter a rage,"
Right.
or like or if you happen to have like the alert feat, which is actually a very good feat. Can't be surprised, and you have +5 on your initiative.
Which is great.
Yeah, I always think about taking the alert feat I'm making either a tank to want to go up into melee to sponge the hits first, or I want to be like the battlefield control or battlefield support type of character. I want that extra +5 to initiative so I can lay down a fairy fire or a maelstrom or a twinned haste or whatever it may be. Get that off as soon as possible so
Possible.
everybody else can just go in and start wailing on folks.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep, so there's definitely a lot of merit to that. And also another um, interesting tidbit of information is about combat is that whenever you score a critical hit, it's always whatever dice that you're rolling, you double that. if there's a static modifier, rules as written, it stays whatever the static modifier is.
Right.
However, the GM can say otherwise and just say you can double the static modifier as well. But generally, the static modifiers just stay the same.
Yep.
Yeah. And also, we can't talk about combat without talking about my personal favorite optional rule, flanking. I personally always turn on that optional rule in all of my campaigns. And
Not a controversial topic at all.
basically, for those that don't know, what flanking is if two characters that are allied with each other are on exact opposites of an enemy to them, then they get advantage on their attacks. So that could be pretty. That's pretty powerful, depending on the type of build and character that you're using. So
Absolutely.
that's really good. However, I have heard some folks counter that with saying, but it bogs down combat a little bit with folks trying to figure out, all right, how can we get into advantage position,
Sure.
especially in maybe like AL where you have a lot of folks that you may or may not see again.
Right.
I usually say with flanking in terms of that argument, if you're playing with the same people day in, day out for campaigns spanning like years or months or whatnot, typically after a couple of sessions, everybody already knows, all right, we want the paladin to get advantage every time. We know how to get into position. That's a mood point.
You're right. Exactly. Once you're used to fighting with your 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 other PCs, the other players at the table, it gets a little bit more. Uh, it's a little bit simpler, a little bit easier to know who's going to move where, why they're going to move, what they need, what they don't need to help them be be most efficient during the combat phase.
Yeah. And the other argument I've seen for it is that advantage is a pretty powerful as opposed to in previous editions where you might just get like a static +2 or something like that numbers, which I do have to agree with. Advantage is pretty powerful, especially if you happen to have the elven accuracy feat, which basically says if you have advantage on on an attack that's using either your dex, charisma, wisdom, or intelligence, whichever you picked for that feat, instead of rolling 2d20, you're in effect rolling 3d20.
Yeah. What?
Which, if you happen to be building a great weapon master or a sharpshooter character, that's really gonna negate the -5 penalty almost every time.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great way to increase those odds, and yeah, it makes it a very powerful um, component to be able to try and take advantage of.
Yeah. And then another part about combat that I think needs to be talked about is, especially in larger parties where you have a lot of turns between allies and enemies going taking effect, is basically when it's not your turn, you should always be looking at, all right, what are some things I want to do on my turn, so it's not bogged down in terms of timing as much.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Be preparing for your next turn.
Yeah.
I think there's a little bit of a balancing act that has to occur when you're doing that, though, right? Because you also want to you also want to be engaged in the story a little bit and what everyone else is doing.
Yeah.
But you shouldn't just. I 100% agree, though. You shouldn't totally just disconnect from trying to prepare for your turn, and then when it's your turn, be what? Huh? Oh,
Yeah.
I got something. I need to do something. Have an idea so that you can keep combat running smooth.
Yeah, and I can't remember where I learned this from, but a while back I actually learned that something good that would be very helpful is to have a backup plan just in case like you're like super engaged and forget to prepare, or like the battlefield changes between when you were preparing and your turn or something like that. So for instance, if you're like a let's say you're a barbarian that's already raging, great, plan for your turn, but in case things change, have that basic backup plan where if you have to, just say, all right, I'm just going to run up to the nearest enemy and attack twice recklessly, you know.
Yeah.
Or it's like I'm a sorcerer. If all else fails to keep things moving, I'm just going to ray of frost somebody.
Right. Right. Always have that thing in your back pocket because Battlefield could be very fluid depending on the DM's whims and desires.
Yeah. And then also when this also pertains to the other pillars as well, but depending on how you multi-class your character, you can have some pretty powerful combat shaping things on both ends of the spectrum. So always keep those things in mind. Not only if you're multi-class, and even if you're just sticking with one character, always strive to really learn your character and know what your characters can do, like what your spells can do that you picked up. At least have some idea of what they can do. It will really speed up combat.
Yep.
Yeah. And then speaking of combat, so there's a little term that's probably widely known as murder hobos that you that loves the thrill of killing things. If you're in a party of murder hobos, you probably should expect a lot more combat than your average table.
Very true.
So
Very true.
that's probably where it comes down to knowing your fellow players and folks, and maybe even send that expectation of, hey, are we going to be doing a lot of killing and whatnot?
Yep.
And
I
and I tend to find that especially if especially if you're under the experience level up as well, you tend to find a lot more folks wanting to get to that next combat to get that monster exp from killing them or parlaying with them or whatever. So if you're
Yep.
doing the exp, make sure that you're warranting good xp for like your role playing and your other non-combat stuff, or else players would after a while will just say, all right, we don't care about the town guard. We just want to go out the town real quick and kill a few zombies or something because we want to gain that next level.
Who cares about the puzzles that you set up, DM? We got some killing to do.
Yeah. So that's so there's definitely a lot of things to really keep track of, and especially when it comes to turn order. This goes this is a little bit more towards GMs, but figure out what turn tracker works for you. Whether it's typing it up on a notepad plus plus file or having something physical or having a whiteboard, whatever. Figure out something that works so you can have idea of, all right, it's this person's turn. We know who basically who's coming up next to be on bat.
One thing I like to do is also kind of note down the initiative order in my own notes
Mm,
so that I can help remind people that their turn's coming up or it's their turn, or because there's a lot of stuff already on the DM's plate because they're managing not only the turn order stuff, but any monsters around the field and their health and attacks and rolling dice and environment or layer effects, right? There's a bunch of things that they're worrying about in the middle of combat. So as a player, I think taking those notes down and just kind of helping out a little bit is also a useful tip.
and And I would agree with that. Anything that players can, I think anything that players can reasonably do to help their GM out takes a little bit of the pressure off. It's definitely, you're going to make the GM's life a lot better. And who knows, that might just save your life. GM just might be, yeah, I remember you were really helping me out for quite some time. I'm not going to throw 15 Trask at you.
Wow.
No, that's a little
We
bit overboard.
went from the extreme to the insane.
If your GM throws 15 Tarask at you and doesn't allow you to send like armies to deal with 14 of them, you should probably look for a different table or GM or something like that.
Yeah, that's a bit much. A bit much.
Yeah. And then I'm glad you brought that up, as that reminded me of something. A little bit of advice for GMs. GMs, don't put more than about 2 or 3 spellcasters out on your side of the field, because every spellcaster, especially full caster you put out, that's a lot of spell lists that you have to keep track of.
Yeah.
Yep, so definitely keep that in mind.
Yes, definitely, definitely.
Mhm. So I think we got everything good to go on combat.
Yeah, I feel like we've covered it pretty well. There's probably a few points that we probably have missed, but right where this is more of just a beginner's refresher, quote unquote, and not necessarily going into all the dirty details, but I think we've covered it pretty well.
Yep. The only thing that I would probably add to that before we move on to the next pillar is just remember about character death. Um, if you drop down to 0 hit points, you're not technically dead unless something specifically says so. It's only if you reach negative 100% of your max HP do you actually die. So always keep
Right.
that in mind during combat and other non-combat situations too.
Right.
So next up, we have probably my second favorite pillar, RP roleplay. Basically, that's all about your talking to other folks. I want to go in a bar and talk to the barkeeper, get some information. That's roleplay. I want to try to simmer down the crowd. That's roleplay. And I think, and just overall, I think every D&D campaign needs to operate with at least 2 of these pillars. Whether it's exploration and combat or whatever, I think at least 2 pillars are needed. Might not need all 3, but at least 2 is needed for any campaign, I think. But when it comes to roleplay, I think there's a lot more freedom in what you can do than in combat. As you can definitely do a lot more of your ability checks while role playing. Like you can use your persuasion, your performance, maybe a little bit of history or whatever it may be.
A little bit of deception, maybe,
Hmm.
if you wanna, if you're trying to trick somebody or lie about something that you know.
Yeah. And while we're talking about ability checks, um, so the first thing is um, when when a player wants to do something, I feel like you should always remember not necessarily always ask, "Hey, can I make a perception check? Can I make an Arcana check?" You should strive more towards, "Hey, here's what I'm trying to do. This is what I want to do," and more so then let the GM say, I think it's more along the lines of this type of check.
Yeah. Be, that's a little bit more. interactive in the role play in that regard, then and letting the story and the DM sort of mold that and fold it in versus you forcing something that forcing to always use perception because you've got expertise and proficiency and all of that stuff on your perception,
Yeah.
right? So I think it makes it a little bit more well-rounded when you're able to do that.
Yeah, when it comes to that, there's actually like two different ways of actually going about it. You can go either the descriptive route or the active route. So, like the active route is actually saying, like you get into character, you using your voices, whatever it may be, saying, all right, I'm gonna lie by saying this, that, or the other. Okay, cool. Give me a deception check. Descriptive, on the other hand, is yeah, I just basically want to lie to these folks saying that about that the Lord actually brought us in as their squires. Okay, make a deception check.
Right.
Yep, so those two different ways will definitely depend on maybe your mood for the day or the campaign or the party or whatever. And you can definitely interchange between those two.
Yep.
Yep. And then also with ability checks, as awful as it may seem, there are a few god tier abilities in D&D 5e. Perception being number one.
Yes.
There's a reason why a lot of folks say that if you can take perception, in terms of proficiency, take proficiency in perception so you can see stuff.
Yep.
Because both active and passive perception are just so powerful in 5e in terms of just like spotting an enemy or whatnot. And then I feel like a few other really powerful and common ability checks would be stealth is another one, especially if you're trying to be sneaky around something.
Yes.
Persuasion, intimidation, and deception are some pretty common ones for obvious reasons during roleplay.
Yep.
And then also, investigation and arcana are also pretty common and popular skill checks. Investigation for searching for things, and arcana for basically all of your magic related stuff. Although, depending on what you're doing, you may or may not be able to substitute like religion for some sort of divination magic. But
Right.
but usually otherwise it's probably going to be arcana. Although I could see maybe a nature check for druidic magic. But maybe athletics and acrobatics could be some common checks as well, depending on the game and everything.
I think some of these are, I think the acrobatics and the athletics and the nature and maybe even like history, some of those other types of skills are probably a little bit more character or campaign focused, whereas some of the other ones that you mentioned are almost always good, no matter the campaign or the character, right? You always, perception is something that you're probably always going to use. You're always going to have some sort of uh, thing about investigation, right? You're always going to be interacting with NPCs and other characters, so your intimidation or your deception or your insight, right, is going to be useful always, right? They're not so much character driven or campaign driven.
Yep, exactly. And and while we're on the subject of abilities, rogues and bards are always known as the skill monkeyers of the game because they get so many freaking abilities
Take
and,
almost everything.
and expertise. And when you think
Yep.
about bards, is whatever they don't have proficiency and expertise in, they have jack of all trades for. Again,
Yep.
upwards of +3 and at later levels. So it's one of those things where it's like, You definitely want to. A lot of this stuff is you definitely want to have at least one player in the party having some of these ability checks, like your perception, your persuasion, stuff like that, because role play tends to be a heavy usage pillar within campaigns.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and and roleplay spans so much from your interactions. Like one of the common tropes of D&D is, all right, let's go to a tavern to find some information, or,
Yeah.
and which is cool as long as it's not the only type of scene. And
They call it a trope for a reason.
yep, and so it's always it's sometimes cool to say, all right, I want to go up to the barmaid, and speaking of RPing, let's not forget that age old fun trope of the horny bard.
Oh, bards, oh, bards.
And for all of y'all who ever played a horny bard, you know who you are. It may be all fun and games until the GM asks for that Constitution save against an adult red dragon.
Man, here we go. Here we go.
But,
Maybe we should move on to the third pillar here.
yep. So the third pillar is exploration. So basically that's like in the name, that's all about your exploring different things. So exploring the jungle, exploring the dungeon, you're traveling from point A to point B, assuming that you're not hand waving the travel. So we can start there since we're already on it. So when it comes to travel, there's two different ways of going about it. You can either a hand wave it and say, hey, yeah, and this kind of goes on with everything else as well, but you could say, yeah, it takes you about 5 hours to get from point A to point B, or it takes you 3.5 hours and you find 15 fish and a buffalo to eat, or something like that. Or you, or you could be one of the folks that want to say, all right, you want to forage for some food. Let's make a couple of survival checks. First survival check, where do you want to look? All right, you want to look around a giant tree. All right, let's take a look at that survival check. You find about 3 apples and a pear off of that survival check. Let's move on to this next berry tree. So on and so forth. So there's definitely two different types of ways you can go about that. Um, which, which is definitely useful because every character short of high level druids and monks need some sort of food and water and stuff like that to survive.
Yep.
Although the first level druid and ranger spell Goodberry does help mitigate that entirely.
True. True.
Yeah. Or if
I,
you're
I do.
or if you're like a foraging ranger or you have the outlander background to find food even easier.
I do think that the adventuring piece is a little bit more nuanced sometimes, and a little bit more. Let's not worry. You kind of do the extremes sometimes, right? With that, there's some parties and some tables that they wanna worry about the food and the water and the time it takes to travel and hit up every little you know nook in the road. And then there's other times where there's tables and groups that are like, nah, just warp me to the next town, warp me to the next dungeon.
Yeah.
And I kind of think that you've got to find more of a balance and a middle ground in there, right? You
Yeah.
want to do a little bit of both. Sometimes it's good to take that time, that travel time in between, to allow the people at the table, the players, to work on different skills, or different things that they want to do, or introduce different parts of your world, as the DM.
Hmm.
But then there are times where it just doesn't make sense, right? It's just there's no real point story wise or time wise to do that, right? And so warping to those other places is sometimes what you need to do.
Yeah, and in terms of that, also encumbrance also fits into that a little bit too. Just how much stuff how much weight a character can carry is based off of their is it strength or strength mod? I can't remember. Um,
I'll double check while you keep talking.
yeah, so that's encumbrance is one of those things that really heavily depends on what group you're in. Um, that can either be a very big thing that you have to keep track of every gold piece you have, every spare you have, something like that. Or you can just be in the other extreme of groups where it's like, I'm not going to worry about encumbrance as long as you're not doing anything out of reason, like trying to carry a boulder or something like that.
Right. I think I think most people probably do the latter, right? It's not usually a big deal.
Yeah, at, at least me personally, I feel like it's because doing the latter is a lot easier. Because typically, as a GM, you're worrying about so many other things. So why throw in an added, potentially unneeded thing?
Right.
And then same thing with with temperature, and especially when it comes to medium and heavy armor. Typically, if you happen to be in a very hot climate, like 100-degree weather, and you have full plate armor on, I forgot the time frame it takes, but after some time in full plate and 100-degree armor, your character automatically suffers a level of exhaustion.
Right.
Yeah, and I feel like those things could potentially be hand waved unless your group really wants to dive into that type of stuff. Um,
Yep. I
Although
would
if
agree.
you're in the middle of a desert, you should probably visit that every now and then.
Right. I think setting here is very important on when you want to be able to pull some of these things like encumbrance in, and it is your strength score multiplied by 15.
Gotcha. And and also in terms of encumbrance, your size also matters a little bit too, right? I think.
Yes, yes. Larger creatures can carry more things, and tiny creatures carry less.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's why if you look at different things, it says your size counts as one size larger. Like for instance, I believe that's one of the features of like a Goliath. You're able to
Right.
carry more because you're considered as your tip. You're still a medium creature for most things, but in terms of carrying and pushing and stuff, you're considered one size larger. But just for those type of interactions, so you have to keep those in mind. Um, so, so that's definitely a lot of nuances when it comes to travel, and I feel like that's um, traveling and that pillar. That's probably the least explored pillar of D&D.
Probably.
Yeah, for various reasons. Some groups just don't like it. Other time, a lot of the reasoning also comes from it tends to be a lot of extra little minuscule details that you have to keep track of, unlike the other two pillars.
Right. I agree with that. I think one of the other key aspects is sometimes I think the traveling aspect of it, the adventuring piece, is kind of the quote unquote boring parts of the campaign, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're not as always exciting as doing a fancy RP or some mega long combat session, right?
Yeah.
But I think the other side of that is sometimes those traveling, if you have sessions where you do a lot of traveling or adventuring, right, then it's it's kind of the glue, the glue and strings that hold everything together, right?
Yeah.
Because it can show you that progress that you're making as a character, or you can see that you're growing your skill set. And if you go back and look, you'll be like, oh, it was during this, and it was during this time and this time and this time that I was able to do these things that were very character focused
Yeah.
versus playing, versus some sort of outrageous or major experience point in an RP or combat session.
Yeah. And exploration, especially in like jungles or whatnot, definitely should especially be looked at in consideration if you happen to have a druid or a ranger in the party, especially a ranger, or else that natural explorer feature is going to be,
Yeah.
assuming that a player took that and not went with the Tasha's version. Which, by the way, Tasha's did do a good job of helping out the Beastmaster Ranger a little bit.
Yep, definitely.
Yep, for all of your Beastmaster Rangers, we'll definitely be probably taking a look at some of that stuff at some point in the future or not. um,
Probably.
yep. And then also another thing when it comes to exploration and maybe a little bit of combat as well as the whole underwater concept of things that not a lot of folks tend to deal with because it's underwater, but characters can hold their breath for I want to say 3 plus their constitution modifier in terms of minutes, minimum of 1.
That is correct.
And there's only a few select weapons that you can attack normally with, such as tridents, I think nets, short swords, stuff like that. Otherwise, everything else has disadvantage, or in the terms of ranged options, they miss outright past their regular attack range. So that's definitely something to keep in mind from both aspects when if you're ever doing any sort of underwater type of thing.
Yep.
Uh,
Good things to remember.
yep. Unless you happen to have like a druid and a cleric just going ham with the control water spell.
Or water breathing.
Yep. Which you should always try to ritually cast that unless you really need to burn a spell slot immediately. It's like, we're going on a boat. Alright, give me 10 minutes. I need to cast this water breathing.
Yes. Just give me a few minutes, guys. So, well, I kind of feel like we've really covered the three pillars here pretty well.
Yep, I think so too. If anybody has any more thoughts and ideas, definitely throw them in the comments below. We would love to hear from you. And while you're down in the comments, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell, or whatever shape that notification tends to look like. And until next time, folks, keep your life and your geeky hobbies together. That's why it's called the Geek Life.
Bye.
Until next time, guys.